Okay, welcome everybody. Today we have Charles Hoffman, who spearheaded the XRBL standards. XBRL standards. And today we're going to kind of talk about how that relates to the importance of cross-organizational collaboration. Obviously, standards are a key cornerstone of that. Charles is going to talk about what it takes to move that forward in a persistent, dogged manner. And sometimes it could be a nightmare, as he stated previously. But we want to hear the details. We want to hear why it's important. And I'm sure everybody here has a lot of questions around it. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you. So you want me to repeat what I said before we started the recording?
Yeah, if you could, that'd be great.
So right now, the world has an opportunity. So the world has been connected by the internet, people agreeing on the networking protocol to use, TCP/IP, and that has basically enabled everybody in the world, almost, and it's getting better even, to be connected for pennies. So people are physically connected. And initiatives like the creation of the XML specification and the HTML specification, the way that software vendors like Microsoft and Google and others are making the browser, more standard, is helping things get connected. Another part of that is the semantics, getting people connected logically. And if there's other pieces to that, and other pieces the structure, the models. So if all those pieces are in place, then work can be made vastly more efficient by removing the need for humans to get involved in rekeying information in order to have it flow through a process. And what I participated in, it began as or a conscious choice was made early to focus on the report aspect, the pinnacle of the entire process, which is, it's really not the pinnacle, but basically to create a standard financial report in XML. And that basically became XBRL. And early in that discussion, they actually changed the scope from financial reports to just reports. So a financial report is a type of a report. It's a pretty complex type of a report, but it's just a report. And what we did with XBRL was create a standard syntax, physical format for reports. And when we started this process, my background, I'm a CPA. I'm not a technology person. I didn't understand the difference between syntax and semantics, literally. And I confused the words all the time. But, I sat down with a technical person that understood this stuff, and they helped me understand these technical details. And fortunate for me, I had a background in formal logic, so I can understand a lot of things. It was very helpful in understanding a lot of the dynamics. So we created the standard, and kind of a mistake that we made, I believe it was a mistake, is that the domain people, the people that needed the standard, the accountants, didn't participate to the level that they really should have participated. And because of that, the technical people, they punted a little bit, made things too flexible so that they could handle all the use cases that were not clearly defined. And that made the standard more complicated to use because it was more general. And that distracted software vendors to build software that was general. And so we have hard to use software because the domain experts did not do their job and, design the models well so that the software vendors could build easier to use software, and so that the quality of reports could be what it needs to be, et cetera, et cetera. We got something pretty early in a couple of years. We started XBRL. I did my initial experimentation in like 1998. XBRL International was formed in 1999. We had a first version of the standard in 2000. We had a second version slightly after that, and then a third version in 2003, and several implementations around the globe. These were pretty basic implementations where they were form-based systems, so they were not customizable systems. But XBRL was built to be customizable. But I couldn't figure out how to use XBRL correctly, and most other people didn't either, because we didn't understand how to control the customizations of the reports. And to make a much longer story short, that's why I created what I now refer to as the Seattle method, which is a method of working with XBRL where the users are allowed to customize reports, but the customizations are kept within permitted boundaries, which allows effective communication when users can customize reports. So this was so important that, I mean, before I even called it the Seattle method, which that's another long story how I came up with that name, but I was invited to talk with the object management group with their FIBO, Finance Industry Business Ontology. I went to a meeting. They invited me to a meeting to explain XBRL to them. And I started the meeting and I asked them, so what do you think XBRL is? And they really didn't know. So I explained to them what XBRL was, and it wasn't what they thought it was. And I said, hey, we need something from you guys. We need a model. And we started talking, and we ended up that day, within hours, realizing that we needed what they came up with the name of standard business report model, which is a logical conceptualization of a business report. And that is now an initiative that the OMG is, we started it several years ago and we got it almost done. And then COVID hit and then it kind of stopped everything in its tracks. But now it's getting going again because of the Financial Data Transparency Act. Are you familiar with that? So I don't think so. So basically the Financial Data Transparency Act is a law that was passed by Congress, signed by the president into law, and it requires 7 federal agencies to use structured information for the collection of these reports that have typically been collected on paper or in PDF or something like that. So while, so I just want to kind of wrap this up and then start taking questions. Basically, what I have learned as a domain expert is, number one, the domain people need to be involved in this process. If they aren't, then they'll be given stuff that will not serve their needs. So it needs to be a process. Number two, there needs to be a leader. There needs to be orchestration. What's happening in the space that I'm in, there's not really leadership from what I would call the leaders in the institution of accountancy globally. There's people taking steps, but they're not really leading. They're kind of like more following. But what is really needed is a conductor of the orchestra. If right now you have all these people playing music, but it's not really sounding like an orchestra, you need to have a conductor that pulls these things together, because that's the only way that standards can be built. I mean, someone's got to be the conductor. And sure, it can be a large corporation like Apple that basically imposes something on people. And sometimes that's a good thing. Other times it's not so good. But today, business people and people with domain knowledge need to participate in this process, because that's what makes it work the best. So what I'm trying to do is, we've taken this financial reporting thing and changed it into modifying the entire supply chain of accounting, reporting, auditing, and financial analysis. So we're basically converting something that's driven today by electronic spreadsheets, basically Excel, which is not a good tool for what we need. It was the only tool, 40 years ago when I started in accounting. I started in accounting with paper spreadsheets. The electronic spreadsheet was a blessing, because you can solve lots of problems by using it electronically, but it's also a curse, because you can't do the things that you guys are trying to do to standardize, to try and get two electronic spreadsheets to talk to each other is very challenging. So what we're doing is making it semantic oriented spreadsheets. And we're putting together, I'm literally inventing a new way of doing accounting, reporting, auditing, and analysis of all of those reports. And it's working, it's moving forward, and at least proprietary solutions are going to exist, but I'm trying to create a standard solution that pulls all of these pieces together. But the key is the domain participation, understanding the problems that have to be solved, and working with the technical people to solve those problems, getting the correct software built because the correct standards were built, etc. So let me stop there and just answer questions. I don't know if I'm hitting what you want to be hit.
Yeah, no, it's actually perfect. There's a lot of people on this call that would heartily agree with you on having attention to domain expertise for sure. I'm sure there are a lot of questions and the importance of semantics, but I really like that phrase you just gave about semantic oriented spreadsheets, because people in data management often talk about the curse of spreadsheets, but their utility can't be denied. And so what is that happy medium between the utility of spreadsheets, but some semantic mapping between everybody's mindset? Everybody likes their own playground or sandbox, but at the same time, we need to be able to talk to one another. That's where the standards come in and semantics take hold. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions.
Let me answer your question really quickly. So it's not an either or thing.
Okay.
Today, we have the electronic spreadsheet. we don't have the semantic spreadsheet yet, or we actually do, but it's not been, we don't have the software to make it work the way that it needs to work. And we're not trying to replace all electronic spreadsheets. What I'm trying to do is to create another type of spreadsheet that I'm calling a professional spreadsheet, or a modern spreadsheet, or a semantic spreadsheet. So the other electronic spreadsheets, Excel, will continue to exist because they have use for all kinds of things. But for other things, they're not appropriate. You need a different kind of tool. So the average per Gartner, the average Fortune 1000 companies uses 800 spreadsheets, 800 Excel spreadsheets to create their 10K report that goes to the SEC. 800 spreadsheets. It's not workable. It's flawed, but there was no solution to that until now. So I'm with you. The semantic spreadsheet is going to be cool.
Go ahead,
Good
Greg.
question. So I guess I would like to hear more about your use of semantic there, but I sort of tie that into something else you'd said about standardizing a form, and in terms of modeling that, whether you take an approach that's more structural in terms of like maybe think the layout of the form, the sort of the design elements, or more functional, right? Is it like what does a header do? What does a column do? Versus the semantic, like what does this particular column mean, right? So you have to sort of unify the layout, the structure, the function of what's happening in the report, and then the semantics of what are the values, of what are their types, what do they mean? And so you had said about sort of the need for putting constraints on all of this, getting domain experts to sort of make it real in the concepts that they're actually dealing with, but also in some sense, like you want a solution that's standardized, meaning that you have unified structure, function, and semantics in a way that it can be applied anywhere, but it has to be intuitively applied anywhere, right? So I'm curious your thoughts on, I mean, maybe it's all of the above, if that's maybe my opinion, but what do you think about sort of where in your experience you found success with a structural approach to solving the modeling problem versus a functional approach versus a semantic approach?
So it's a very good question. And basically what you need to do is separate the problem and let people choose whether they want, what problems they want to solve. So what we did it with XBRL, very early on in XBRL, we had this conversation, and you had the business people and you had the technical people. And the technical people, they were talking about which approach to use to create financial reports. And they started talking about this atomic approach. And the business people were completely confused. It's like, what the heck are you guys talking about? But basically, the conversation was about, are we going to take an XML type of an approach to representing financial reports? Or are we going to take an RDF type of an approach to representing reports? So what ended up happening is we took the atomic approach, which it completely removes the layout issue. Layout is just a bag of problems because you're not going to get, two people to agree on what the layout of the information needs to be. It's just like when people create Excel spreadsheets, some want to do it horizontally, some want to do it vertically. Some want to have, this color, this font, whatever. So what I'm doing and everything that I'm doing, particularly with this semantic spreadsheet, is two things. Number one, layout is is not driving anything. It's all driven by logic. People can agree on logic. Humans have an innate understanding of logic. Okay, business people, technical people. And if you let logic drive things, then you can actually agree on lots of stuff and get a lot of work done. If you want to add the next layer, the layout layer, in XBRL, we've done that also. We created this thing called inline XBRL, which is basically a layout layer where you put the semantic information into the layout, but you can use the semantic information however you need to and ignore the layout if you want to. So, I mean, let me stop there. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, but I would think, is there not pushback when you're saying, well, we're standardizing reports, and people are going to say, well, if you're standardizing reports, I want to know how I do my layout. Like, how do I express the way I want this to look?
So the approach that I'm taking is, number one, we're focusing on logic. So that gives you a huge opportunity to, again, do useful stuff. People are going to realize that they're making a mistake. They're making a mistake if they're focused on, people tend to be document centric, not data centric. But you do have to take this information and put it into a format that's usable. So what I've done is I have created one format. I can take the logical information and I can represent that in a form that is readable by humans. It's not the preferred format of every human, but it is a format that a human can actually do work with. And that's done by looking at the best practices in accounting and reporting, you know, understanding the difference between the logic of the information and how that information has to be laid out so it can be understood by a human. So for example, in accounting, and you guys probably understand what a roll-up is, right? You have 5 things and then you have a total. In accounting, for a roll-up, you have, you know, single underscores and double underscores to indicate totals, and you have ways of showing subtotals and stuff like that. And that's one kind of a layout. And people understand that. And there's actually a lot of best practices in financial reporting as to how things are laid out. But we also have a thing called a roll forward. A roll forward is different than a roll up. A roll forward, you have a stock, a balance, then you have changes to that balance, and then you have another stock at a different point in time. You also have adjustments. An adjustment is when you have a number that was reported and that number had an error, so you have to modify that error to get to the restated number. And basically, we've taken these reports and I've identified the logical mathematical patterns and all the logical patterns in the reports and have created what I call a canonical representation of that information in using a layout. If you want to change that layout, you can do it by changing the style sheet that drives the layout. Or if you want to change it even more, you can create an entirely new layout. Or you can map information from the logically represented information into a pixel perfect layout that you want to create. But if you don't take that approach, you're stuck with having only one approach. You only have a layout-driven approach instead of having the opportunity to have a logical approach, a layout-driven approach, or multiple layout-driven approaches. Is that making sense?
Yeah, no, I agree. I definitely agree that the presentation comes last, right? The format is sort of maybe the least important thing to get right, because it's going to go in so many different directions at the end. Could you say more about so you mentioned the logic and the mathematics, and obviously in accounting, there's a lot of mathematics there. How integrated is that to the logic that you're talking about, and what kind of logic are you using to represent the sort of structures of these forms and reports?
So here's what I did. So for XBRL, and particularly the area that I'm the most interested in, which is US GAAP financial reporting using XBRL and IFRS, International Financial Statements reporting using XBRL. So the Securities and Exchange Commission required every public company in the United States to submit their reports to the SEC using XBRL starting in about 2009. Okay. So what I did was I started reading those reports using computer processes to try and extract information from the reports, and that wasn't working. And I knew kind of why it wasn't working, but I wanted to understand exactly why it wasn't working. So the thing that I knew is that, again, a financial report is not a form. Companies are allowed to determine what subtotals and totals they are can report, how to organize information within those subtotals. So basically, you don't have one form. You have what I realized were different reporting styles. So if you can imagine a financial report from Microsoft being different than a financial report from Wells Fargo Bank, because they have different things going on in the company. So there's different rules for a deposit oriented institution and a software company. And basically there are patterns in these financial reports. So what I did is I pointed software at all of those reports, all 7,000, and I literally reverse engineered all the patterns. I knew there were roll-ups, so I went after roll-ups. I identified all the roll-ups, and I noticed a couple things like all these roll-ups, 80%, 90% of the roll-ups actually rolled up. But there were a lot of roll-ups where they didn't roll up. They were providing these mathematical computations, but they also provided rules that said how they worked. But the roll-ups didn't actually foot, which was not good. So to make a much longer story short, I reverse engineered the patterns from the actual reports because I, as a domain expert, I can tell you if the report was wrong, understanding both XBRL and the domain of accounting and reporting. I can look at a report, tell you if the report is wrong, or if the XBRL was applied incorrectly. And I just identified all the different patterns. And
you probably don't know anything about me, but I'm working on something called pattern logic, which is a unified theory of logic expressed in a fixed graph scheme of patterns. So I'm curious, when you use words like pattern, I certainly want to hear what you mean by pattern and what you've seen in that.
So we may want to take some of these discussions offline after this call, but I'd be happy to talk to you about that. So there's another thing that you might be interested in. This is probably the most interesting thing that I discovered during this process of trying to basically digitize accounting, reporting, auditing, and financial analysis. So this is very important. There's a thing called the Cynefin framework. Okay, I can send you, I can't spell it. It's a Gaelic or Scottish or something, Cynefin framework. And what the Cynefin framework does is it helps you understand what appears to be chaos. So the Cynefin framework basically says it has 4 quadrants. You have good practices, or you have good practices, you have best practices, you have novel practices. Oh wait, you have good practices, best practices, complex, and novel. So as it turns out, in accounting, 80% of financial reporting is good practices. Another 18% can be explained using best practices. Another, I don't know that I'm getting these percentages correct, but basically the point is that things are more standard than they appear to be. If you really look at what's going on, and I talked to a friend of mine that worked at Deloitte, and he works in tier 4 support. So he basically handles the really hairy accounting problems. And he basically told me that a very small percentage of accounting relates to new or novel things that come up in accounting, or new and novel things for a specific disclosure that come up in accounting. What I mean by that is people have been accounting for inventories, trade receivables, property, plant, and equipment for thousands of years. A novel practice is something like Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in general, right? It's a new thing. And there's been a lot of stuff going on in accounting. It's like, where do you put this on your balance sheet? So that's a novel practice, and it hasn't been sorted out yet by the standard setters, but it will be. And once they understand that, it'll move from novel practice all the way to good practice. The point I'm trying to make is that there are more patterns in financial reporting than I even recognized. And financial reporting is more consistent than you might think. And if you look across other domains, I think you're going to find the same pattern exists. It amazes me. It absolutely amazes me how good the navigation systems are in cars. Okay, you go to an exit and it's like, how does it know that there's these 3 different exits, and it's guiding you through these 3 different exits? And I know why the navigation systems work so well. They're all rules driven. They're not driven by ChatGPT or machine learning. They're driven by people that started in the 1980s to collect this GPS data and put all this data into a database. And now you've got the entire, US and global road system in very good detail in a database, and it allows you to do amazing things because they did a very good job. And that's what you guys are doing, I believe. That's what I'm doing for accounting. It's different information, but this has all been consciously orchestrated by people that they know what they're doing, they communicate, they do what needs to be done, and then they can harness the power of these computers that are really dumb beasts that need to be guided like babies to do the work that we need the computers to do. And it's not anything that's scary, and people are going to be put out of jobs because they don't have to rekey information. How many people enjoy rekeying information?
Olivier has a question.
Yes, it's maybe more a comment than a question, but yeah, it's very good that you bring this Kinefin framework and even the example of the GPS and road maps of roads. I think there is a mindset question also behind this, and maybe more than a layout or functional. Let me say it differently. I'm not from the finance, okay? I'm in the automotive industry. I see the finance world as quite well standardized and regulated. So like you said, maybe 80% of things are well defined, and the fact that everybody uses the same definition is critical. There are a lot of additional domains in which data sharing is relevant, for which we don't have those standardizations. And I think at the beginning, the beginning of mapping roads was like this, is that people, they were thinking about the data first, at least some people. And this is something you didn't mention, but also I like your introduction. And I see a need to rebalance in the IT or data industry from pipes to content to water. Okay, what is flowing inside the pipes? Because interoperability, the internet, TCP/IP, HTTP, whatever, these are standards of pipes, and it doesn't bring any value regarding the content. So having this content-driven people, once again, the water in the pipes, right in their mindset, in their culture, I think it's better, because I would prefer some organization that is sharing some data, saying quite simply and explicitly, okay, this is how it has been collected. This is the data. This is maybe some definitions, the quality measurements we have done with this, and that's it. And it's not standardized. Okay, it's just pushed in a way. And I think in some industries or cross-organization data sharing issues, we need this. We need this because trying to solve, it's a chicken and egg, trying to define standards at the same time that nobody has really done the thing once. Okay, it's a new thing, it's emerging. Okay, so once again, back to the Kinefin framework, when the collaboration is emerging, you need somebody to act without the rules, because there are no rules, there are no good practices yet. And this is really important in my opinion. So I would say mindset is more important than compliance to something that is not yet existing.
I totally agree with everything that you're saying. So I am lucky. I am lucky. Yeah. So the domain of accountancy is 7,000 years old. And accounting existed before writing existed. Writing was invented to do accounting first. And the double entry bookkeeping model was invented in I think 1211 in Italy. And it is that model that drives everything that I'm doing in financial reporting. So you know who needs the most regulation right now in accounting? The regulators. The regulators need to be regulated. For example, what I mean by that is the SEC, in my view, and the audit profession is not really doing their job. If we have these financial crises like we've had several times in the past years, sorry, there's a police car going by. I'm not sure if you can hear that. But today, the way that standards are created is you have people sitting around in a room, they have discussions, and then they put what they decide on into a book. And what they write down can be ambiguous, or saying it another way, it could be less ambiguous if they created a model like a knowledge graph instead of just writing things into a book. And this has come up many times. This is very interesting when XBRL was rolled out in the Netherlands, and the people in the Netherlands were creating their XBRL taxonomies based on the laws that were written. And they were realizing that the laws were not being implemented by the bureaucrats the way the laws were passed by government. And this came out when they started to digitize these laws and then do their standard business reporting stuff with XBRL. So I think that's going to happen more and more. And particularly, it's going to happen first with places that are already regulated. People are going to realize, well, we can document this stuff in new ways, and it makes it easier to understand what's been documented. We can see the ambiguities in what we're trying to agree on. And I agree with you that there are industries that have collaborated and agreed on things. So for example, it seems to me that like printing. Today, when you have these digital colors, right? You digitize the colors, and anything you put into a computer has to be digitized, full stop. So they have to agree on these color palettes. And they seem to have done that. I'm not sure how this works, but the people that are within these areas of knowledge have to understand it's in their interest to take charge of this and orchestrate it and get it how they want it. Because if they don't, then you're going to have a bunch of IT people making decisions that they shouldn't be making. A good example of that is driverless cars. So who do you want deciding if there's a situation that a driverless car, and I took philosophy in college, and I never really understood why are we having these hypothetical discussions, but now I get it. If you are programming a driverless car and you have a scenario where someone's going to die, you're either going to have to do this or do this, because you have a situation where a pedestrian gets killed because the car has to do one thing, or the driver might get killed because the car does something else if you have a specific situation. And that's not a good example. I have a better thing written down. And who do you want to make those decisions? IT people or other people that are experts in an area of knowledge. I think that the domain experts need to make those kinds of decisions, not the IT people.
Let's let Phil get a chance, and then Greg, you can follow up after him.
Great, thank you. This is a fascinating area. There's plenty to take away on all sorts of different levels. The thing I'd like to come back to is something that you said quite early, because I was listening to this kind of like 80-20 division in terms of standards, pre-existing practices, and so forth. But you mentioned something very specific early on, and that was the idea of a canonical model. Canonical models come loaded with all sorts of baggage from left, right, and center in terms of, how you arrive at them. And I wonder what process you went through in order to arrive at the models that ultimately work and serve you today.
So that's a good question. And you're right, they come with a bunch of baggage, but they also come with a bunch of benefits. So the way that I came up with my models is basically by reverse engineering everybody else's model. So, for example, in financial reporting, so I was interested in figuring out, what is the best way to do a specific disclosure? So let me give you an example. In financial reporting, you have a disclosure called long-term debt maturities. And all it is, it's like, what are the current maturities after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and thereafter. Okay, that's the disclosure. Many companies, in fact, most companies, over 80% of the companies have a total in that disclosure. So 20% didn't. So the benefit of having that total in the disclosure is that you can reconcile that list of numbers that adds up to that total to the actual balance sheet, where it breaks down the current portion and the non-current portion of long-term debt. But there's never a total portion of long-term debt on the balance sheet, but you can put it in that disclosure if you add the total to the disclosure. So this may not make a lot of sense, but the point is, when you connect those disclosures by adding the total, it reduces the probability of making an error. So I also have a background. I have an MBA, and my focus was then it was called world-class manufacturing techniques. Today it's called Lean Six Sigma. And what Lean Six Sigma is about is reducing errors, reducing flaws, reducing rework. So if you look at these canonical models, it's like, what is the objective? What is the objective? The objective is to create a proper financial report. If you have things in there like these totals, and you have patterns in reports, and you can demonstrate, my report is not wrong because I'm doing what 80% or more companies do. You don't have to do it that way. You can modify the model, but mine is better because I can error check things better than you can by not putting that total in the report. So you can start having discussions about these different ways of doing things, this, bag of arguments that you get when you're trying to get people to agree. And again, XBRL is not about creating one form. You don't have to have one canonical model. Create 10, right? If you don't like this one, fine, create another one. We have 2. Can't agree on 2, make it 3. But at some point you'll get to an efficient and effective, set of different ways of doing things. So it's not, a canonical model. Generally, you're talking about one canonical model, but you can have multiple canonical models. That's a way of solving that problem.
Yes, I think I have to agree that, there are models and there are submodels, and many of them can be developed in such a way that they can be intermixed in order to solve particular problems. And I think you've absolutely clarified that in a great way with some good examples. If I can have one supplementary question before I hand back to the rest of the team, is, can you say anything to the actual agreement process itself in terms of the community that took their standard and how they worked with you so that you arrived at the structure, the XBRL standard? Because to me, that feels like it's the ultimate challenge in bringing all these things together from the different dimensions so that it works for everyone.
So that is a very interesting question, and I have a very interesting story about that. So when the SEC started collecting financial reports from public companies, I started probing those reports with software. And I was realizing, it's like, hey, there's errors in these reports. And I started, again, this is a benefit that I have because of the model in accounting. So the obvious first thing that I did is I literally created an Excel application that could read all 7,000 reports that were submitted to the SEC. And I told the Excel application, go grab the value for assets, go grab the value for liabilities and equity, and then calculate the difference between those two and tell me if the difference is anything other than zero. Because a balance sheet balances. You have assets, you have liabilities and equity. And if I point an Excel application at all 7,000 public company reports, I would expect to get 7,000 balanced balance sheets. Okay. So the problem with that is that it's wrong. Why is it wrong? It's wrong because you have companies that report using the liquidation basis statement of financial condition. So it's basically a different type of balance sheet. Then I said, okay, no problem. So I modified my Excel spreadsheet to have two balance sheets, a statement of a liquidation basis balance sheet and a normal balance sheet. Okay. And then I would run it against the report. And I literally found 53 companies that had balance sheets that didn't balance. And those are obvious mistakes. And those, I mean, can you imagine an accountant creating a balance sheet that didn't balance? Well, 7,000 minus 53 did create balance sheets that balance, and then 53 did not. So then I took it one layer below that. And then to make a long story short, I spent 5 years perfecting my rules and sending emails to people that would listen to me because they wanted to do it right. But I told them, hey, you're doing this wrong. Please fix your report. And they fixed their report. Then, after all the people that cooperated, the quality was getting higher and higher in these reports. So it was easier and easier to send information to companies and point out their mistakes, and then they would be forced to fix their mistakes. And I got to the point where I would send emails to the investor relations department of Boeing, Alaska Airlines, and other companies. And most of them ignored me, but some of them fixed their mistakes, but the quality kept getting higher and higher. And the higher the quality is, the harder it is for people to justify doing something that's wrong. And basically this forced XBRL US to create what they call the data quality committee that basically writes rules that, and so it's basically a process. And, you know, accountants don't like making mistakes. And, you know, if you point out something that's obviously wrong, and I was really impressed by one company, Merrill, Top and Merrill. I pointed out an error that they made, the same error 79 times in about, I don't know, 500 reports that they had. They made it 79 times. I sent them this mistake, and the guy, they said, you know, how dare you tell us we're making mistakes? But then they read what I was saying, and then they came back to me and said, you know, Charlie, you're right. We did make a mistake. And they fixed all 79 of those errors. So most people are reasonable, you know? I mean, it's an orchestration process. And it's really important. It's really, really important, because garbage in, garbage out. If we don't get these things dialed in, they're not going to be useful. And, you know, you're seeing that from the ChatGPT stuff, where people, they're pointing out that, well, these computers make mistakes. It's like, well, it's not designed to be perfect. It's a statistical based approach. It can't be perfect. A rules-based system can be perfect to the extent that the rules are perfect, but a statistics-based system can't be perfect.
Perfect. Charles, do you have enough time for another question?
Oh, absolutely.
All right, go ahead, Greg.
So you sparked a memory for me. So it was probably about 5 years ago. I met with Bill McCarthy for about 3 hours and talked through the REA accounting model. And I see on the Wikipedia sites, even there's a history or a linkage between these two approaches. And I'm curious for your take on this. So you'd mentioned the double entry bookkeeping sort of being, you know, around for 1,000 years or less. And I know Bill's opinion was, you know, that perspective of sort of my books and your books, right? That all the accounting world is split into the mine and the yours, and we report based off of sort of our own perspective, misses the more ecological approach or the more comprehensive view of an economy, right? Or you need to track everything in the economy, not just like my perspective of it. And so I know he struggled to sort of create that mind shift into taking a more comprehensive view of economics. And that particularly accountants like are focused on the business or the client or that single perspective. So I'm wondering just to hear your reflections on the contrast there, because I understand REA is sort of trying to take that global approach, and that XBML is more of XBRL, sorry, is more of the limited. It sounds like you're maybe seeing both sides of that, or I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
XBRL is not an approach. It's a technical format.
Okay.
And I know Bill McCarthy, and we've talked about this many times. He actually came to Seattle and we had a good conversation. And to make a much longer story short, what Bill is doing is great. A lot of things what Bill is doing is great. There's some things that I believe that the REA people have gotten wrong. Okay, and Bill has backed off on some of these things. So first, what they've done is when I first was hearing about REA, they were basically trying to throw out the double entry model, which is a big mistake. They're missing a point by trying to throw that model out. That model is about quality, controlling quality. And by having separate ledgers that are then compared, you both can help find mistakes and help find fraud. So it's not appropriate to get rid of the double entry model in REA. So, but they backed off on that.
Have you found a way to sort of have both mindsets then?
Oh,
reflect-
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's nothing different between what Bill McCarthy is trying to do and what I'm trying to do. It's actually the same thing. And there's another guy in Switzerland, Actus. He's doing the same thing that Bill is trying to do. Basically, and they both help me understand that I should not be dealing with transactions, because accounting is not about transactions. A transaction is a means of representing what you really want to track, which is the business event. A business event leads to transactions, which leads to information that gets put into a financial report. Okay. So in my view, REA is an awesome thing. And what needs to happen is the database of enterprise management systems, ERP systems, and the interface needs to be separate. And the rules of how things go into the accounting system both need to be separate and higher in volume. So basically, imagine ERP systems that are driven, they're basically like expert systems. Imagine an ERP system being an expert system, and it's driven by all these accounting rules that say, you know, what's allowed to go in certain accounts, and et cetera, et cetera. So take that and add to that. So there's, so I live in Seattle, and I have a view of Elliott Bay, and I see container ships coming in and out all the time. Did you know that 99% of all the documentation that goes into you know, the bill of lading, the invoice, the customs documentation, did you know that 99% of that stuff is on paper? It's paper-based.
Wow.
There's an effort right now being pushed by the International Chamber of Commerce and the World Trade Organization to digitize and standardize 7 key documents that are used in global trade. Things like a bill of lading, a packing list, customs documentation. There's 7 different forms. Imagine if you coordinated what the International Chamber of Commerce and the World Trade Organization is trying to do with what Bill McCarthy is trying to do with REA, with what I'm trying to do with financial reporting, what other people are trying to do with financial analysis. They're trying to basically remove bias from financial analysis and make financial analysis more efficient. Imagine coordinating all of that stuff together. You know, that's where all this is going, in my view. So Bill McCarthy, unfortunately, Bill McCarthy went to one of the early meetings of XBRL International, and he tried to communicate his ideas to the technical people. And they were very, very good ideas, but they didn't listen to him. They didn't listen to him. And that was unfortunate, because I think it would have been, and then Bill was not persistent. So XBRL International did a lot of things that I didn't like. And I told him, and I was very persistent, and I piss a lot of people off. And, you know, I don't care. I don't care. And I don't have to, because I don't work for a big company that has to make people happy. I'm just a consultant, and the objective is the system. The system is the objective. XBRL International and all these other groups, they're just parts of the system. And they don't own the system. We own the system. The people who have to use the system own the system. And there's no center of the universe. We all have to work together if we want to make all this, take advantage of the internet and all these standards efforts and, things that can make, for, in my world, accounting, reporting, auditing, and analysis work like the cell phone standard works. Or there's lots of other standards that are out there that do really good things. And it's hard work. It's hard work creating these standards. And, it's not my mentality to, work with, I don't like groupthink. It's really hard. It's really hard setting standards.
But one more question. Can you say a little bit more about what you think a transaction is then? I mean, I agree with you in terms of maybe it's the wrong focus for accounting, but what is it then?
It's a business event. Business events.
About an event. Okay. So more
A business event
to an event. A
That's
record
what
of an event, or
say again.
it's the record of an event. A transaction is sort of the details of an event, or
It's an explanation of an event. So it's an explanation of a business event. A company is more than its business events, but you can only, document things to a certain degree. It's like when you digitize a recording of music, you lose a lot of stuff. And I have friends that say that they can notice the difference between a vinyl record and a CD. I can't, but when you digitize things, you lose a little bit. So it has to be a conscious choice of, where, what fidelity level do you want to have? And for the accounting world, business events is what drives the transactions that go into an accounting system that are used to provide the quantitative information that comes out in the form of financial reports. You also have qualitative information that explain those. When you have a complex financial derivative, there's more narrative that has to be used to describe the business event that's occurring.
are you trying to unify both those qualitative and quantitative aspects then, or do you feel those have to be separate models?
They're separate. I'm more on the quantitative right now. Qualitative is a lot harder. It's a lot harder to.
That's something from I'm finding a logical representation of qualitative logic that actually is the same logical system as that which represents quantitative. So it's been a fascinating area of research for me to sort of try to think about integrating those into a single format or a single framework. But I think there'd be a lot of promise if we could ever get something like that into the world, right? Where you have integration of the qualitative and the quantitative.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating session. Thanks much, Charles. We definitely appreciate it. And I will be uploading this to YouTube, and I'm sure the rest of the team will appreciate listening to this, if not once, a few times. Yeah, this is great.
I'm glad you found it useful.
Yeah.
So can you tell me again, can you tell me what exactly are you guys doing?
What's our goal? Yeah. So sometimes it's not always that clear, but I'll speak for myself, and others probably have a slightly different perspective, but I think we're all on the same page in terms of wanting to find out. I'll give you an example. You spoke about essentially an independent observation of patterns of some phenomenon, and that there's a common patterns emerge after you see the same patterns through independent observation. Well, I think what we're trying to do is say, what are these common patterns that emerge across organizations when they start interacting with one another? And how can we leverage those common observations to develop these standards in a way that is not like one size fits all canonical model, but more like canonical for a given facet or perspective. I guess that's how I see it. And so we're trying to crack that nut. And every time we enter a new domain, you discuss one in particular, it reinforces kind of the target that we're shooting for. And sometimes it brings up new perspectives that we didn't think about. So yeah, it may be an intractable problem, but we're the kind of folks that like to tackle those, I think. Hope that helps.
No, it's a very good explanation. I would strongly recommend, I'm not sure if you guys know about the Cynefin framework, but it'll help you do. Okay, perfect. Because it helps people understand that there's more in common than you might think.
Yeah.
The objective is to find the patterns. It's not to try and destroy. Oh, it's like, no, there's no patterns here. That's not what that's not in your interest. You want to find the patterns because the patterns mean you can build software.
I agree. I think we all agree.
Mm.
All right. Thanks much. This is awesome. Can't say enough. And I'll be sending it out soon. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.